Ahoy! It's the beginning of a new season, the Pro League hasn't started yet. Because of that, people tend to be a little bit lost on the Conquest map. But you've come to the right place, because today we're going to try and fix that. We're going to do that by talking about starts for all the different roles in the game, so you know where to start in order to get the most benefit for yourself out of it. There are some roles where multiple starts are possible, and there are certain counter starts as well, but we'll begin with the most common ones. As a general point beforehand, the spawn timers were changed with this season, meaning that all buff camps now spawn 20 seconds into the match, and many harpies spawn 30 seconds into the match, while other objectives spawn in a little bit later, some 5 seconds later, some even later. The buff spawning so quickly gives you a lot of opportunity to secure them right away, and also gives you a good opportunity to hit level 2 very early on multiple roles. Here's a quick overview of all the gold and XP values that are now on the map. You can check that out on my Twitter at DukesLoveTV. There are some very minor inconsistencies in this, since purple buff apparently now gives more XP than the patch notes described, and Scorpion is actually giving some really weird values overall. But this will give you a general idea of how much XP there is on the map, and it will help us figure things out here. Let's begin with the duo side of the map, which now also includes the mid laner. And that is because red buff spawns at the same time as speed buff, which means there isn't really much of a reason for the mage or the mid laner to start at speed. Because you want to have the red buff is closer to your wave and it gives the same XP, so seems like a better option. The goal at the start of the match is obviously to not lose too much HP or time while clearing the camps and get to level 2 as quickly as possible. Getting to level 2 requires 308 XP. Now let me explain the most popular start right now. This begins with the mage and the carry starting on red buff. They clear the red buff together, and when that is finished, the mage will pick up the red buff and go to middle lane. The carry, however, will move over to purple buff, where the support has already started the buff once it spawned, and the carry basically just has to finish it up. Then the carry picks up the purple buff and they both go to lane together. This will likely be the most common start for a while, since that's what's being ran in ranked, that's what's being ran in a lot of videos, and that just makes it the most popular option. We'll get into the effectiveness and the alternatives in a bit. First, we'll have a look at the most common starts in the short lane, on the solo side. Here, what you will probably most frequently see is the jungler and the solo laner starting together on speed. They then go to one of the harpy camps, sometimes even both, clear one of them or both, and then move on to the blue buff, clear that together, and from there they split path and the solo laner goes into solo lane, while the jungler either goes back and clears up one of the harpy camps that wasn't cleared, or goes towards middle lane. My prediction here is that over time we will most commonly see the jungler and the solo clear the speed buff, the two small harpies, and the blue buff together. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best start. Again, this is just what we'll see the most for a while until people figure things out. And I'm going to try and help figuring things out. For that, we're going to look at these starts in more detail and also talk about alternatives. Let's first move back to the duo side of the map. Reminder, here the ADC and the mid share a camp, and then the ADC and the support share a camp. Now, again, our most important goal for every role is to get to level 2 as quickly as possible, which requires 308 XP. While the XP values between last season and this season were changed slightly, for the mage not all too much changes. If you share the first camp with the ADC, then you get 137 XP for that. Clearing a whole wave on your own gives you around 240 XP. That means you're well above the 308 XP threshold and should be hitting level 2 at some point during the first wave. Since the red buff is very close to middle lane and you can clear it relatively quickly with your ADC, you will actually get to the wave just as the waves come together anyway, so you're not gonna run any risk of missing out on XP. So really there isn't all too much that I would change as a mid laner here. You're just getting an easy way to get your buff, take not too much damage while doing so, and hit level 2 on the first wave. Even if you solo red buff, which some mages most certainly can, you'd still end up with a similar result. You would get 221 XP from that camp, but you would still hit level 2 in the first wave. You hit it a little bit earlier and you'd get some pressure out of that, sure, but you would also take longer to clear your camp in the first place, and you would likely take more damage while doing so. So I don't really think that's necessarily a trade you want to take. Now, what about our duo laners? The XP for the support doesn't actually change. If you were to start with your ADC right on purple at the start, or if the ADC comes over, the XP stays the same for the support. So you will not level up earlier under any circumstances unless you choose to triple clear the red buff, but that comes with a variety of downsides for your teammates. The carry himself, however, gets huge benefits from sharing both of these camps. And that has to do with what I talked about earlier, with the XP values being slightly off. I'm not sure why this is the case, but as it stands, purple buff gives you a little bit more XP than the other buff camps. It's just 4 extra XP, but they make exactly enough of a difference. So what happens is that after clearing both red buff and purple buff, the ADC will have 278 XP. This is not enough for level 2 yet, but if you kill a single melee minion in the wave, that is exactly enough to hit level 2, which basically means it happens right after you get into lane. And this is interesting, right? Because if this was just slightly adjusted downwards, if this was just exactly like the other buff camps, then it would take you 2 melee minions, which would in turn mean if the enemy is able to make you delayed enough that 2 melee minions are dead, you would have to clear a melee minion and 2 archers to hit level 2. So that would be a huge difference, but that's not the scenario right now, because right now purple buff gives a little more XP. During the start, you may lose out on 1 melee minion depending on which guard you're playing. You can offset this by, for example, getting a guard with Hog, getting your support with Hog, or maybe even your mid lane or getting it yourself in order to clear the other camps quicker. That's only if you're playing an ADC that clears really slowly anyways though. And I would say because this gives such huge leverage to the ADC by getting level 2 so early, this start goes pretty uncontested right now. You could of course start in lane and pressure things back very hard, but you wouldn't really deny XP, you'd maybe even help the enemy by bringing the minions closer to their tower and not making them lose any. You could start on your own purple and you would still just get less XP even though you're in lane a little bit earlier. And outside of that, there aren't really any options that seem all too viable to me just yet. Maybe something will come up, but generally speaking, I do think this start is the most efficient with what is offered on that side of the map. That's also partially because the most accessible harpy camp are the back harpies, which you don't want to rotate towards. Over time, starts might shift in an entirely different direction, where the support goes to the middle lane with the mid laner and helps secure camps there, but that's a whole different story that we're not going to look at this point. For now, I would say on duo side, the start goes relatively uncontested, and even stalling guards can't really sacrifice enough to prevent that from happening. Maybe we'll see some creative solutions in the future, and we will most certainly see some of those when it comes to the solo side, with the jungler and the solo laner. And I'm honestly really excited about this, since there are so many options here with all the different camps and where both characters can start. Let's begin with the 2 methods that are primarily being popularized at the moment. The first one is one that, for example, FineOK has been using a lot, where the solo laner and the jungler start on the speed buff and then clear both the 3 harpies and the 2 small harpies and then go to blue buff, and then the solo laner goes to lane and the jungler goes to middle. And the alternative is what, for example, Weekend has been using, where he does basically the same start but skips one of the harpy camps and does that later on his own. Like he goes back there as a jungler while the solo laner goes to solo after clearing 2 buff camps and 1 harpy camp. Now here's something very important to keep in mind. As I said, it takes you 308 XP to get to level 2. So that is our goal. Ideally, we want to get our solo laner and our jungler to level 2 as quickly as possible, so that they can utilize that to get an advantage with the extra ability that they have. So what happens in these 2 starts? If you clear all the camps on that side that are available, the 2 buffs and the 2 harpy camps, then you will get a total of 384 XP per guard, both the jungler and the solo laner. This puts them into level 2 and gives them a little bit of extra XP after that. However, the XP from just speed buff, blue buff and the 2 small harpies is still 317, and that is still enough to get you to level 2 before you get to lane. And this, I think, is something that's very interesting and worth keeping in the back of your mind. You don't have to clear everything to hit level 2. And this will be important, especially when it comes to countering these strategies as well. So there is a third option, and that is having the solo laner start on blue and solo that, while the jungler solos the speed buff and then the other camps and goes to middle, but we'll get to that part later. We talk about solo first here. In that case, the solo laner gets 217 XP from blue buff alone. 217 XP is not 308 and will not get you to level 2. However, this start will get you to lane earlier. And what that means is that you will get some more minions. And more specifically, if you're for example using Chark with Bluestone, then you get the 3 melee minion XP, which is 150 XP in total, and that puts you at a total of 367 XP. If the enemy soul laner rotates with a jungler, they usually sacrifice these first 3 minions and basically just get the XP from the archers. If you compare the XP now, then it's actually much closer. Then soloing blue still gives you 367 XP, which is very close to the 384 of clearing all the buffs. And if you're in lane first, you can further abuse this by simply not pushing the wave. Because there are circumstances when the enemy soul laner jungler are a little bit slow, don't have the right starters or anything like that, where they may end up actually losing even more XP, where the soul laner may miss out on one of the archers. And if you just miss out on one of the archers, then the XP here is already in favor of the solo laner who started on blue and is already in lane. And not only that, the solo laner who starts on blue is also able to position himself closer to, for example, the totem already, just set himself up for clearing right away, be very close to the minions, while the enemy solo laner has to walk down there first. Alternatively, the solo laner who's there first obviously also has the choice of pushing the wave into the enemy tower and either make the enemy solo laner take a fair bit more damage or deny them some gold. There are obviously downsides to this start as well. You will take some damage from blue buff, so you will probably want to use one pot at the start of the game, and it depends a little bit on which guard you're playing. It is super easy to do if you're playing a guard with Mannequin Scepter, which is very strong in solo at the moment, and it's still reasonably easy to do if you're playing a Bluestone guard. But if you're opting for Warriors X or another defensive start, then on some guards, though not all, you may run the risk of losing out on maybe 1 or 2 minions at the start, which could be a problem in terms of overall XP. So the decision on which start you want to do should realistically depend on which guard you're playing with which build, but realistically, people are probably not going to play like that in game. But it's most certainly worth noting that starting on blue is definitely not a bad start, so if you see someone doing it in game, they're not necessarily doing it because they're bad or stupid or not following the new meta, but rather because there is definitely effectiveness to the start. It is only less effective if you don't freeze the wave afterwards. Before we move over to the jungle, I also wanted to briefly touch upon XP efficiency. So what you might say is, okay, but if we share camps then we get more XP because it has a 125% multiplier, and that's then divided by 2 for the 2 players. So effectively we get more XP overall, which is true. If you share 3 camps, you get 127 extra XP between the both of you. And if you share all of the harpies, then you actually get a total of 154 extra XP between the both of you. But at the same time, by not clearing 3 melee minions, you also lose 150 XP, and you will most likely not make it to lane by 44 seconds with the start. So all this XP you gain, in most circumstances, is XP you burn in another place by simply not being there for the minions dying. Not exactly a net gain in my book. So what I would suggest, especially if you're using a solo laner with mannequins, is just tell your jungler that you're going to start on blue and they are going to do speed on their own. It's fine for them, it's not actually a downside, we'll get to them in a sec. But I think it just overall gives you more advantage in lane in terms of pressure, and you're not actually making much of a difference in XP with whichever start you go. Just make sure to freeze the wave and not attack the wave initially if you want to get that XP advantage. If you push the wave, you give the enemy more XP, and that's what you want to avoid. And don't get impatient here, I actually underestimate how long some starts take, and sometimes you can let them lose more than just the melees, so you can wait around for that. But now let's talk about the junglers. So again, our main goal here is to get to level 2. We can do that by just clearing 3 camps with a soul laner, but there's also another way. If you end up in a situation where you start speed buff on your own, then you will get 221 XP from the camp. At this point, you obviously want to hit level 2, and there are 2 camps that are available. The harpies, the 3 of them with the big one and the 2 small ones, give you 107 XP. That makes for a total of 328 XP with a speed buff, meaning that is enough to get you to level 2. The 2 small harpies give you 70 XP, which would not be enough. So what you can do is clear the speed buff and go to the 3 harpies. And then, instead of clearing the 2 small harpies, which I know doesn't take that long, you go straight to middle. You sacrifice 70 XP here, but you get to the right mid camps or the solo side mid camps first. And this is important, because while you sacrifice 70 XP here, you now are in a prime position to secure these camps and then a lot of other camps that come afterwards. The right mids, when shared with your mid laner, give you 46 XP. If you solo them, they already give you more than the small harpies, they give you 74 XP. But if you clear them with your mid laner, you're now in an advantageous position. You're not only getting that extra farm, you're also denying the enemy team that extra farm. So they lose around 90-ish farm from this, 90 XP. Then you are probably in a better position to push the next mid wave, and therefore in a better position to secure the left mids as well, with the same XP value, and possibly also the oracles, which come with an additional 61 XP when shared. So you can see how this initial gain in XP can kind of snowball here, and you also get significantly more gold from these harpies. Now obviously you run the risk of the enemy being there in time as well, especially if they run a more aggressive starter than you, and that's worth keeping in mind, but that would mean that otherwise they would be completely denied to you, and so this way you at least have a chance to secure them. If you get completely bullied out, you always have the option to just go back to those two harpies and get them as XP if nothing else is available. But the reason why I would suggest prioritizing the other middle camps is because that is the main farm that is available on the map right after coming from the buffs. That's because normally you would rotate to red buff afterwards, but red buff is already cleared at the start of the game. As such, the sources of XP just are around the mid lane for the most part, and you want to try and secure as much there as possible. If you're not running a Bumper start, you can even further this by including Hog in your build. This doesn't work on everyone with every build, but you can see it here, for example, with Thanatos, where I get to mid insanely early because of this. It may feel weird at first to just leave some XP standing around, especially if it's easy to clear, but it may just turn out in your favor because it gets you to the most important spot on the map quicker. And the same can be done if you're clearing with your solo laner, arguably, possibly even better in that case. This doesn't work as quickly as the Thanatos example here, but you can definitely clear blue into harpies into speed, and unless the enemy is the Thanatos with Hog and mannequins, you can then go straight to the mid camps and ignore the back halves and secure the mid XP first. Again, if you end up losing that contest, you can still just go back to the other harpies, which in this case is even easier because they're closer, since it's the 3 harpies, which are also worth a little bit more. My point in either scenario is you don't have all too much to gain from clearing both harpy camps. Choose the one that is effective for the particular route that you're going for. If you're going with your solo laner, then just choose the 2 small ones. And if you're going as a jungler on your own, then I would say get the 3 with a big one so you get level 2. And then make your way to middle lane, and after that consider if you want to go back and clear that single harpy camp. The farm is better around mid, the fights happen around mid, and you want to be with your mid laner ASAP, especially if the enemy is running something like mannequins, because otherwise they're just going to burn through them. Now, one of the caveats with the starts where you're soloing camps is that you will take some more damage from them. That's because you're clearing them slower, and if you're the solo especially, then you won't have a sustain item against that. That is something you have to accept, and again, you have to choose depending on that. The best start on solo right now is the one that counters your opponent's best and works with your guard and your clear and your starter item best. So it really depends. You'll see a lot of double clearing because that's what everyone is running so far, but in terms of effectiveness, that is not necessarily the only way to go. And I would generally advocate against the start where you would do all 4 camps, because usually this will set you back more than you can gain out of it. Even when FineOK does it with good starters, usually ends up getting pushed into his tower by the first wave or losing that to tower. And I don't think that's worth it when it's really not necessary, and once people figure out that you can freeze the wave, it's going to be even worse of a starting position to work from. Long story short, it's complicated but fun. If you enjoyed this and you're new to the channel, feel free to hit the sub button and maybe the bell to get updated for more upcoming Season 8 content. That would help me out a lot and you would stay informed. And other than that, I hope this helps you in your games, and I hope to see you for the next one soon. Duke Sloth, out.